Benjamin Wallace had not spoken a tender word to another living soul in 3 years, and the silence had grown so thick inside the walls of his ranch house that he sometimes pressed his palm flat against the wooden table just to feel something solid beneath him. The year was 1878, and the high plains of Wyoming territory stretched out beyond his window like a canvas that God had painted in a fit of exhaustion. Endless brown grass, blue-gray sky, and the kind of wind that did not howl so much as it simply refused to stop. His ranch, the Double W, sat 12 miles southeast of the small cattle town of Harrow Creek, and in those 12 miles there was nothing but scrubland, a dry creek bed that ran full only in April, and the particular loneliness that comes from choosing solitude over and over again, until one day you realize it has chosen you instead. Benjamin was 34 years old. He had wide shoulders built from 15 years of working cattle, a jaw that could have been carved from the same limestone that jutted out of the hillsides east of his property, and dark brown eyes that his mother had once called the color of good earth. His mother was gone. His father was gone. His brother Daniel had died of typhoid fever in the summer of 1875, and after that, Benjamin had simply stopped inviting people into his life the way a man stops opening a door that has burned him every single time. He had a foreman named Hector Reyes, a Mexican man of 42 who had been with the Double W since Daniel was still alive, and two young ranch hands brothers named Caleb and Tom Hatch from Nebraska, who slept in the bunkhouse and generally had enough sense not to ask Benjamin personal questions. The cattle numbered 340 head. The land stretched for 2,000 acres. By any reasonable measure of the time, Benjamin Wallace was a successful man. He was also desperately, profoundly alone in a way that had begun to carve something out of his chest. At night, after Hector and the Hatch brothers had retired, Benjamin would sit on the porch with a tin cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago and stare out at the prairie dark. On those nights, his mind would fill with things he could not say to anyone. Troubles about the north fence line washing out after heavy rains. The nagging worry about a cough that had taken hold of two of his younger steers. The memory of Daniel's laugh, which had been too loud and too frequent, and which Benjamin would have given every acre of the Double W to hear one more time. He talked to nobody. He kept it all inside. The silences stacked on top of one another like stones in a wall, and the wall got higher every season. It was Hector who first brought it up, because Hector had always possessed the particular courage of a man who knows he cannot be easily replaced. "You need to put an advertisement in the papers," Hector said one morning in late March, not looking up from the harness he was mending. "One of those matrimonial ones." Benjamin did not look up from the fence post he was examining either. "No, you are becoming strange, Benjamin. You talk to the horses more than you talk to people. Horses don't argue. Neither does a wife if you treat her right." Hector finally looked up, and there was no jest in his dark eyes. "You are a good man going to waste out here, and this house is too big and too quiet." Benjamin dropped the fence post into the soft earth with more force than was necessary. "I don't want a wife, Hector. I have told you this before. I don't want someone depending on me and worrying over me and needing things from me that I don't know how to give." Hector was quiet for a moment, the way a man is quiet when he is deciding how honest to be. "Then put an advertisement for a housekeeper, or a companion, someone who can cook your meals and sit across a table from you, someone you can just talk to, at night when it gets bad." Benjamin looked at him sharply. Hector raised one hand in a gesture of peace. "I hear you some nights, walking around in there when you think everyone is asleep. A man can only hold so much before it starts to break him." Benjamin said nothing for a very long time. The Wyoming wind moved through the dry grass with its tireless, indifferent voice. "I'll think on it," he finally said. He thought on it for 6 weeks. Then, on a Thursday in early May, he rode into Harrow Creek, and after an embarrassing length of time standing outside the office of the Harrow Creek Gazette, He went inside and dictated an advertisement to the printer's assistant, a young man who had the good grace not to smirk. The advertisement was plain and honest, which was about all Benjamin knew how to be. It stated that a rancher of good standing in Wyoming territory, age 34, was seeking a woman of reasonable age and steady character to serve as a companion and housekeeper at his property. It stated clearly that he was not necessarily seeking a wife, that the arrangement would be proper and respectful, and that the woman would receive a wage, room and board, and full use of the house kitchen. He added, after a moment's pause, that the ranch was well maintained and the work was not overly burdensome, and that the position would suit a woman who was comfortable with open country and the quiet rhythms of ranch life. He read it back. It sounded stiff and strange. He left it anyway. Pearl Ralston read that advertisement on a Tuesday morning in June, 3 weeks after it had been printed and forwarded through a chain of papers all the way east to Kansas City, Missouri, where she was sitting in the narrow room she rented above a dry goods store and trying to work out how much longer she could afford to stay there. Pearl was 26 years old. She was not beautiful in the way that made men stare. She was striking in a quieter way, with chestnut hair that she wore pinned up practically and gray-green eyes that missed very little. She had grown up in Missouri, the daughter of a schoolteacher father who had died when she was 19 and a mother who had remarried badly, and then, 3 years ago, had died of a fever that might have been treated properly if her new husband had been willing to spend the money on a doctor. Pearl had spent those 3 years working as a teacher's assistant, as a seamstress, as a boarding house cook, and she had become very good at making small amounts of money stretch, and very tired of being at the mercy of other people's decisions. She had no family left that she could rely on. She had one good friend named Clara Whitmore who had married and moved to Colorado 2 years prior. She had a small trunk of belongings, a book of poetry she had owned since she was 16, and a fierce, quiet determination that had gotten her this far and which she was beginning to feel fraying at the edges. She read the advertisement twice. A companion and housekeeper, Wyoming territory. Good standing, not necessarily seeking a wife. That last part made her pause. She had seen the matrimonial advertisements before and had avoided them, partly because the desperation in them frightened her, and partly because she had no interest in handing her life over to a stranger without any say in the terms. But this advertisement read differently. It read like a man who was being honest about what he wanted, which, in Pearl's experience, was rare enough to be remarkable. She wrote a letter that same afternoon. She was honest in return. She told Benjamin Wallace that she was 26, that she had experience as a cook and a housekeeper, that she had taught reading to children for 2 years and could keep accounts if needed, and that she was not afraid of hard work or open country. She told him she was looking for a situation of mutual respect, not charity, and that she understood the arrangement he described and found it agreeable. She did not tell him about her mother, or about the particular loneliness that had taken up residence in her own chest, or about the fact that she sometimes talked aloud to herself at night just to hear a voice in the room. She sent the letter, and then she sat very still for several minutes, and then she went back to her mending. Benjamin received Pearl's letter 11 days later. He read it 3 times, which surprised him. It was a well-written letter, direct, sensible, no dramatics. He appreciated the directness. He appreciated even more that she had not asked him a single question about his feelings or his personal history, only about the nature of the work and the conditions of the arrangement. He wrote back the same evening, which was faster than he had planned to. He told her the position was hers if she wanted it, described the route from Kansas City to Harrow Creek, and mentioned that he would send the cost of the train fare if she would provide him with the name of a reliable telegraph office. He told Hector the next morning, keeping his face deliberately neutral. Hector smiled so wide that the expression reached his eyes and stayed there all day. "Not a word," Benjamin said. "I haven't said anything. You're thinking it very loudly." Hector went back to his coffee and said absolutely nothing, which was somehow worse. Pearl arrived in Harrow Creek on a Wednesday afternoon in early July, stepping off the Union Pacific spur line with her trunk, a carpet bag, and an expression of calm alertness that she wore like armor. The town was modest, one main street with a general store, a saloon, a land office, a small church, a feed store, and a scattering of houses that petered out quickly into open prairie. A dog slept in the middle of the dirt road. Two men in dusty hats talked outside the feed store. The sky above was enormous and blue and slightly terrifying in its scale. Benjamin was waiting at the station. He was harder to misidentify than she had expected. He was the tallest man on the platform by 2 inches, and he stood apart from everyone else in a way that seemed less deliberate than simply habitual. He was wearing a clean shirt and had made some effort with his hat, which he held in his hands when he saw her approach rather than keeping it on his head, a small gesture of courtesy that she noted. "Miss Ralston," he said. "Mr. Wallace," she replied. They looked at each other for a moment with the frank, measuring curiosity of two people who have agreed to something unusual and are now trying to assess whether they have made a terrible mistake. He was not what she had pictured. She had pictured someone older, grayer, more worn down. He was worn, certainly. There were lines around his eyes that had been put there by weather and grief equally, but he was not defeated. There was still something upright in him. He was not what he had pictured either. He had not let himself picture much, which was a strategy he employed to avoid disappointment. She was younger than he had half expected, and she looked at him without flinching, which some people did not manage on first meeting. "I've got a wagon," he said. "I assumed you might," she said, and something in the way she said it, not unkind, just dry, made him almost smile. Almost. The drive out to the Double W took just under 2 hours. The first 30 minutes were nearly silent. Benjamin focused on the team, a reliable pair of bays named Marcus and Lincoln, and Pearl looked at the landscape with the expression of someone cataloging information rather than feeling overwhelmed by it. "It's very flat," she said finally. "Gets hillier to the north," he said. "Some good ridges up that way." "Do you ride that way often?" "Sometimes, when I need to think." She nodded as if this made complete sense, which it did. She had her own version of the same habit, long walks through whatever city she'd been in, moving until her thoughts settled. "The house is large?" she asked. 4 rooms downstairs, 3 up. Kitchen is separate but connected by a covered walkway. More than I need by myself, which is, he stopped. "Which is why you need someone to help maintain it," she offered, completing the sentence without making it awkward. "That's right." Another silence, but it was a slightly different quality of silence than the first one. Less like two strangers and more like two people who had not yet found all the words but were at least searching in the same direction. The Double W came into view around the bend of a low rise, and Pearl's first sight of it was Benjamin's house against the immense sky, white-painted wood, a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides, a red barn set back and to the left, the bunkhouse beyond that, and a kitchen garden enclosed by a low fence on the south side of the house. It was prosperous-looking without being showy. It had the settled, solid quality of a place that had been built to last. "It's a good house," she said, and there was nothing polite or performative in her voice. She meant it. He looked at her sideways quickly. "Daniel built the porch," he said, and then stopped as if he had not intended to say that. She did not push him on it. "It's a fine porch," she said simply, and left the space for him to fill or not fill as he chose. He did not fill it, but he also did not close off the way he had expected to. Hector came out of the barn when they pulled up, and his greeting to Pearl was warm and easy, the greeting of a man who is genuinely relieved. Pearl responded in kind, and Benjamin watched the two of them exchange a few sentences with a faint sense of surprise. She had a natural ease with people that he had not anticipated from her letter. The letter had been so precise, so measured. In person she was still measured, but there was warmth in it. She settled in quickly. The room she took was on the 2nd floor, on the east side of the house, and it had a good window that caught the morning light. She thanked Benjamin for it without making a fuss. By the second day, she had cataloged the kitchen and identified 3 things that needed replacing and 1 pot that needed mending, and she presented him with the list at supper, straightforward and practical, and he approved the purchases without discussion. The first supper she cooked him was not elaborate bean stew with cornbread and dried apple cake, but it was better than anything that had come out of that kitchen in 3 years, and he ate all of it and said so, and she said thank you in a way that suggested she had meant for it to be good. They fell into a routine quickly. Mornings, she managed the house and kitchen while he managed the ranch work. Afternoons, when the heat was worst and the cattle work slowed, she would sometimes come to stand at the fence rail and watch the horses in the far paddock, and occasionally one of them might drift close enough to exchange a few words before the work pulled them apart again. Evenings, they ate supper together at the big kitchen table, and at first the conversation was spare, the weather, what needed to be done, small practical observations. Benjamin found that he could talk about ranch matters with her more easily than he had expected, because she listened with genuine attention, not the polite half-attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak. It was on the 9th evening that the first real conversation happened. They had finished supper and the dishes were done, and Pearl was sitting at the kitchen table with a small lamp lit, mending a tear in one of the curtain panels. Benjamin had come back in from checking on the horses, a habit he had before sleeping, and instead of going directly upstairs, he stopped in the kitchen doorway. "I lost 2 steers last winter," he said, not quite to her and not quite to the room. "Couldn't figure out what happened to them. Found them out by the north fence just down. No sign of illness before, no marks on them. Hector thought maybe they got into something. I still don't know." Pearl looked up from her mending. She did not say "that's terrible" or "oh, how awful" in the reflexive way of social obligation. She thought about it for a moment. "Do you have locoweed on that section of the North Range?" He blinked. "Some. I've tried to clear it, it comes back. My father read me an article once about cattle losses on the northern plains. Locoweed was the cause in a number of cases they documented. The symptoms can look like nothing until they drop." She paused. "It might not be that, but it might be worth looking again in the spring." He stood in the doorway for another moment. "I'll do that," he said. Then slowly, he came and sat down across from her at the table, not quite as if he had decided to, but as if his feet had made the decision before his mind caught up. He talked about the North Range for a while. Then he talked about the fence line that needed resetting before the fall. Then, without any particular transition, he found himself talking about Daniel, and the summer the porch was built, and how Daniel had done most of the work in 3 weeks because he had wanted it done before their mother came for a visit, and how their mother had cried when she saw it, not from sadness but from something else entirely, from the shock of seeing her sons had built something real and lasting. Pearl listened. She asked one question about their mother, and he answered it, and then he kept going, and the lamp burned lower, and the Wyoming night came in around the windows, and Benjamin Wallace talked more than he had talked in a continuous stream in 3 years. Not about anything monumental, just about the things that sat inside him with nowhere to go. When he finally noticed the time and fell quiet, he felt something he could not quite name. Lighter was the closest word. Not happy, he did not quite trust happy, but lighter, as if someone had taken a hand off his shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said. "I've been talking a great while." "I was listening," she said, as if that settled the matter, because it did. He stood up. "Good night, Miss Ralston." "Good night, Mr. Wallace." He went upstairs and sat on the edge of his bed for a long time, staring at the dark, and for the first time in longer than he could calculate, the dark stared back at him without the particular weight of complete solitude. The summer moved on in the way of Wyoming summer's blazing days, spectacular thunderstorms that rolled in fast off the mountains, evenings that cooled to something bearable. Pearl learned the rhythms of the ranch the way she had always learned things, by observation and patience. She learned that Caleb Hatch was the more capable of the 2 brothers, but that Tom had better judgment in a crisis. She learned that Hector's wife, Rosario, lived in Harrow Creek, and that Hector rode in on Saturday afternoons to see her and their 2 children, and that this arrangement, Hector working on the ranch Monday through Saturday morning and being with his family Saturday evening and Sunday, had been in place for 6 years, and that Benjamin had made the arrangement without being asked because he thought it was right. She learned this from Hector himself, who told her with the pride of a man who respects the person he works for. She adjusted her opinion of Benjamin Wallace accordingly. She and Benjamin had fallen into the habit of talking in the evenings. Not always long conversations, sometimes just an exchange of a few observations over the end of a meal. But the conversations were real. He told her about the trouble with the water rights on the western section of the property, where a neighbor named Silas Greer had been making encroachments for 2 years. He told her about a telegram he had gotten from a cattle buyer in Cheyenne that had excited and then disappointed him. He told her about the winter of 1875, when the blizzard came and he and Hector had spent 4 days riding the frozen range looking for stranded cattle and found 43 and saved 39 and lost 4, and how those 4 losses had stayed with him, the way losses always stayed with him, like notches cut in something that did not heal clean. Pearl, in return, found herself telling him things she had not intended to share. About her father and his books, and how he had taught her to read from Homer before she could manage the McGuffey readers, and how strange and funny and wrong that seemed to everyone but the 2 of them. About Kansas City and the thin-walled room and the feeling of being 1 bad month away from genuine trouble. About her mother and the remarriage and the doctor who was never called, and the anger that she had not been able to put down yet but was learning to carry more carefully. He listened the way she listened, with his whole attention, without rushing to fix or minimize. Once, when she had said something about her mother that was more bitter than she intended, he had simply said, "That's a real grief. Don't apologize for feeling it." And she had had to look away for a moment because the plainness and the rightness of it had gone straight through her. They were not, she told herself carefully, falling in love. They were 2 people finding solid ground. That was a different and legitimate thing. She believed that for about 6 more weeks. The trouble with Silas Greer came to a head in late August. Greer's outfit, the Spur S Ranch, whose land bordered the Double W on the west, had a new foreman, a hard man named Varner who had apparently been given instructions to expand wherever possible. And one morning, Caleb Hatch came in from the West Range to report that Spur S cattle were grazing on the Double W side of the creek, the same creek that the water rights dispute was centered on. Benjamin rode out to the creek line himself, and Pearl watched him go with the particular alertness of someone who understands that a man riding toward a confrontation he has been trying to avoid for 2 years is in a certain kind of danger that has nothing to do with weapons. He came back in the late afternoon with a set jaw and Hector riding beside him. Greer's offered to buy the western section, he told Pearl at supper. His foreman Varner delivered the offer as if it were a demand. Greer figures if he can get that land, he controls the creek all the way down and I have no legal recourse on the water. Are you going to sell? No. Do you have the deed recorded at the land office? He looked at her. Of course. And the water rights are specifically enumerated in that deed. He paused. They were described. I don't know if the language is specific enough to hold up if Greer takes it to a territorial court. You need a lawyer to look at that deed, she said, before anything else. He nodded slowly. There's a lawyer in Harrow Creek, Reeves. He's decent. Then go see Reeves before Greer makes any further moves. If the language is weak, you address it now, not when you're already in a court proceeding. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. He had been thinking about the problem as a confrontation. She was thinking about it as a document. I'll ride in tomorrow morning, he said. He did. James Reeves, the Harrow Creek lawyer, examined the deed language and confirmed that while the water rights were implied, they were not specifically enumerated, and he drafted an addendum that day for Benjamin to file with the land office. Greer's subsequent attempt 2 weeks later, to claim that the creek was on the boundary rather than within W land was met with the filed addendum, and the matter, while not entirely resolved, was at least legally clarified enough that Varner backed the Spur-S cattle off the creek. Benjamin told Pearl all of this across the supper table, and she listened, and when he said, "It was your thinking that headed this off before it got worse," she shook her head. "It was your land and your deed and your willingness to act on it quickly. I just asked the right question." "You're good at that," he said, and there was something in his voice that had moved past the practical and into something warmer, and both of them noticed it, and both of them let it sit there in the lamplight without addressing it directly. That was the night Benjamin stayed at the kitchen table until well past 10 o'clock. They talked about everything and nothing. A book she had brought in her trunk that she had been reading in the evenings, a Dickens novel that she found both infuriating and compelling, and he said he had read Dickens once, David Copperfield, that Daniel had gotten it from somewhere and left it in the house. He said he had not read it with any patience because he had been in a difficult year. She said what year was that, and he said 1875, and she understood without more explanation. She told him about the poem in her book that she had read so many times the binding was cracking at that page. He asked her to read it. She did, her voice quiet in the yellow lamplight. It was a Tennyson poem from In Memoriam about grief and the question of what persists. She read it straight through, and when she finished, the silence was a different quality again, the silence of two people who have just been somewhere real together. "That's something," he said after a while. "It is," she agreed. He looked at her across the table and she looked back at him, and the moment stretched out until it had weight and warmth and an unmistakable quality of meaning. He looked down at his coffee cup. You are not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know, someone more I don't know. I hadn't thought about it much." She smiled, small and real. "I hadn't expected you either." "What did you expect?" She tilted her head. "Someone lonelier," she said. He absorbed this. "Maybe I was. Maybe I just didn't know it yet." She stood up to take their cups to the basin, and as she passed behind him she put her hand briefly on the back of his chair, not on him, just on the chair, and then continued past, and the gesture said something that neither of them was ready to say aloud. He sat there for another minute after she had gone up to bed, listening to the house around him. The boards settled. The wind moved. A horse shifted in the barn. And the silence, for the first time in 3 years, did not feel like being buried. September brought the beginning of the fall cattle work, which meant long days and harder labor, and the particular controlled chaos of moving cattle, sorting, preparing the herd for the winter. Hector and the Hatch brothers were in constant motion. Benjamin was in the saddle before sunrise most days and came in with the light leaving the sky. Pearl kept the kitchen running at the pace. A working ranch required biscuits in the morning, dinner packed and ready, supper substantial and hot when the men came in. She was not performing the work. She was doing it, and the difference showed. One afternoon in the second week of September, Pearl was in the kitchen garden when Caleb Hatch came by and said there was a rider on the south road, and could she look and tell him what she thought because Benjamin was out north of the creek and Hector was with him. She came around the side of the house and looked. The rider was coming slowly, which was either caution or exhaustion. She could not tell from the distance. She went inside, got Benjamin's spare rifle from the cabinet. He had shown her where it was and explained it in his matter-of-fact way in her second week, saying the territory required practical knowledge, and she came back to the porch. The rider was a woman. Pearl leaned the rifle against the wall and went down to the fence. The woman on the horse was older, perhaps 50, and she was not a threat of any kind. She was road-worn and pale and clearly in some distress. She reined in at the gate. "I'm looking for the W," the woman said. Her voice was thin with exhaustion. "You found it," Pearl said. "Come in and get down. Can I help you with the horse?" The woman's name was Martha Fielding, and her story came out in pieces over the next hour as Pearl fed her and gave her water and let her sit in the kitchen. She was a widow from a small homestead about 20 miles east, and her homestead had been in the process of being taken from her by a land agent who claimed her late husband's filing was invalid. She had heard that the rancher at the Double W was a man of standing in the area, and she had come to ask if he would speak on her behalf at the land office, simply confirm that he had known Jacob Fielding and that the man had been a legitimate settler, because apparently the agent had produced a witness saying otherwise. Pearl listened carefully. She told Martha to stay, rest, eat, and sleep in the spare room that night. She sent Tom Hatch to ride out and find Benjamin. Benjamin came in well before dark, dusty, and intent, and Pearl had told him the basics before he had even washed up. He listened, then went in to talk to Martha himself. He came out 20 minutes later. "I knew Jacob Fielding," he said to Pearl quietly in the corridor. "Not well, but enough. He filed legitimate. This agent, a man named Carver, has been doing this kind of thing to smaller holdings, finding technical arguments and pushing widows off land that their husbands filed fair and square." "Can you help her?" Pearl asked. "I can ride to the land office and make a sworn statement. I can have Reeves look at her paperwork." He rubbed the back of his neck. "And I am going to write a letter to the territorial governor's office about Carver. This has happened twice before that I know of." Pearl looked at him steadily. "You already knew it had happened before." "Yes. Why didn't you write the letter before?" He was quiet for a moment, honest with himself. "Because it didn't happen to someone on my doorstep before. That's not good enough. I know that." She did not say anything, but what was in her eyes said that she respected him for saying it. He helped Martha Fielding. It took 2 trips to Harrow Creek, 2 conversations with Reeves, 1 sworn statement, and 1 very firm letter that Reeves helped him draft and that Pearl helped him make more pointed in 3 specific places. Carver's claim was ultimately found invalid, and Martha Fielding went back to her homestead intact. She wept when she left the Double W and shook Pearl's hand for a long moment, and told Benjamin that there were not enough men like him in Wyoming territory, and Benjamin said there ought to be more lawyers like Reeves, which was his way of being modest. After she had gone, Pearl stood on the porch and watched the road where Martha's horse had disappeared, and Benjamin stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a minute. "Thank you," Pearl said then. He looked at her sideways. "What for?" "For being the kind of man who does that," she said. "Not everyone is." He looked back at the road. "You're the one who took her in and thought to send for me." "Yes," she agreed, "but you're the one who had the standing to do something about it. And you did." She turned and went back into the house, and Benjamin stayed on the porch for another moment, watching the light change over the prairie, feeling something warm and unfamiliar pressing against the inside of his chest. He was in trouble, he thought. The pleasant, disorienting kind. It was Hector who named it, because of course it was. "You're sweet on Miss Pearl," Hector said one morning over coffee in the barn, with the directness of a man who has decided the time for subtlety has fully passed. Benjamin did not deny it. He also did not confirm it. He said, "This is none of your business, Hector." Hector smiled into his cup. "No, she works for me. She came here under a specific arrangement. That arrangement can change. I told her in the advertisement I wasn't looking for a wife. People change what they're looking for." Hector set his cup down. "Benjamin, she looks at you the way the land looks at rain. You understand what I'm telling you?" Benjamin stood up and walked out of the barn without answering, which Hector correctly interpreted as the answer. He thought about it for 3 days. He thought about it while he was riding the North Range, and while he was checking the fence line, and while he was lying awake in the particular darkness of Wyoming nights listening to the wind. He thought about the way she had read Tennyson across the table from him, and the way she had pressed her hand briefly against the back of his chair. He thought about the letter she had helped him make better. He thought about every evening conversation since she had arrived, each one a thread, and the threads woven together into something he had not intended to make but which was real and present and true. He was afraid. He knew that about himself. He was afraid of needing something and losing it. He had lost enough, his parents, Daniel, 3 years of his own life to a silence he had chosen, and then could not escape. He had told himself he did not want a wife, and that had been honest at the time, but what he had meant, if he was honest about the inside of it, was that he did not want to love something and have it taken. But Pearl Ralston was already in his house, and already in his conversations, and already, he admitted in the dark on the third night, already somewhere inside him in a way that was going to hurt whether he acted on it or not. He went downstairs on the fourth morning and found her in the kitchen, making bread, her hands white with flour, humming something barely audible under the sound of the dough. She heard him and looked up. "Morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. He poured himself coffee and stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking out at the pale gold light on the grass. "Pearl." She heard something different in how he said her name. She put the dough down and waited. He turned around. He was not a man who could dress things up with flowery language, and he did not try. "I came here with the intention of telling you something, and I am going to do it before I lose my nerve." He stopped, started again. "I know what I said in the advertisement. I said I wasn't looking for a wife. I want you to know that was true when I wrote it. I was not trying to mislead you, and I am not saying it to pressure you now. But I want to be honest because I think you deserve that more than you deserve comfortable silence." She was very still. "I am—" He stopped again, gripped the coffee cup harder than he needed to. "The evenings when we talk, those are the best part of my days, Pearl. The way you think about things, the way you listen. The things you've told me about yourself and the things I have told you that I have never told anyone." He shook his head. "I did not want a wife, but I think I want you, specifically. I think you are. I think this has become more than I expected, and I wanted you to know it, and if that changes things I understand, but I thought it was not fair to you to keep silent about it." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a mockingbird was doing its inventory of other birds' songs. The bread dough sat on the board. The morning light was gold and gentle. Pearl looked at him for a long moment. Her gray-green eyes were very steady. "Benjamin," she said, "you are a man who does not easily say things like that. I know that, which means it is true and not said lightly." "It's true," he said, "and it is not said lightly." She came around the worktable slowly. She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see the flour on her hands and the morning in her eyes. "When I read that advertisement," she said, "I told myself I was responding to a practical arrangement. And I was. But there was something in the way you wrote it. The honesty of it. I thought, here is a man who tells the truth, even when the truth is awkward and strange." She reached up and put her floury hand against his jaw, a gesture so direct and so gentle that it stopped him completely. "I have been telling myself since some time in August that I was not falling in love with you. I am not very good at lying to myself." He put his hand over hers. His hand was large and rough from work and warm. "I'm afraid," he said, because he had said he was going to be honest. "So am I," she said, because she had been honest all along. He bent his head toward her and she tilted hers up, and he kissed her there in the morning kitchen with the bread on the board and the mockingbird outside and the light coming gold through the window. And it was nothing like the cautious, practical, reasonable arrangement they had both signed onto in June. It was something else entirely. It was the thing that had been building in the silences between every conversation, in every evening lamplit hour. In every moment she had listened to him without flinching, and he had listened to her without looking away. He pulled back and looked at her. She had her eyes closed for a moment, and then she opened them, and what was in them was something he did not have a word for but recognized the way you recognize the smell of rain before it arrives. "Well," she said quietly. "Well," he agreed. They stood there for another moment, her hand still at his jaw. "The bread," she said. "The bread," he agreed, and she laughed. And the sound of it in that kitchen, in that house, in that particular morning, was the sound of something ending and something beginning at the same time. October came, and with it the first cold nights and the last of the fall cattle work, and something had shifted between Benjamin and Pearl in a way that everyone on the property noticed but nobody mentioned, at least not to them directly. Hector noticed and was comprehensively satisfied. Caleb Hatch noticed and was bewildered but pleased. Tom Hatch noticed and did not entirely understand, but appreciated the improvement in the quality and frequency of pie. Benjamin was different in the way that a man is different when the weight he has been carrying is not gone but is being shared. He talked more, not dramatically, not in a way that would have surprised anyone who did not know his former silence, but more. He told Pearl things over supper that he had never intended to tell anyone. He talked about his father, who had been a hard man but an honest one, and about the ranch that had been smaller when his father had it, and that he and Daniel had grown together in the years after their father's death. He talked about the time Daniel had tried to break a horse that none of them had any business trying to break and had ended up in the dirt 3 times and had gotten back up 3 times, and on the 4th attempt had somehow managed it, and the way they had all stood around astonished, including the horse. Pearl laughed at the horse story, and Benjamin watched her laugh with an expression that Hector caught through the kitchen window and then very deliberately walked away from, respecting the privacy of it. Pearl went to Harrow Creek with Benjamin on the first Saturday in October. They went for supplies, and while Benjamin was at the feed store, Pearl went to the dry goods store, and there she ran into a woman named Agnes Prout, who ran the boarding house at the far end of town and was the sort of woman who knew everything about everyone. Agnes said, with the particular precision of someone who has been waiting for the moment, that she had heard there was a young woman staying out at the W, and that she was glad for Benjamin Wallace, because that man had been alone too long, and that she hoped Miss Ralston was comfortable. Pearl said she was very comfortable, thank you, and that the W was a fine property. Agnes said, eyes bright, that she supposed they'd be hearing news from that direction before too long then. Pearl said that she really couldn't speak to that, and smiled with perfect pleasantness, and left, and went to find Benjamin at the feed store, where she stood beside him while he argued cheerfully with the store owner about the price of 100 weight of oats, and she found herself smiling for no reason she could have explained to Agnes Prout. On the ride home, the sky turned the color of a bruised plum in the west and the air went sharp with the first real cold, and Benjamin pulled the wagon blanket from behind the seat and put it over her legs without asking, and she tucked it in and said nothing, and they drove home through the darkening evening with their shoulders closed together on the wagon seat. "Pearl," he said, when the lights of the ranch came into view. "Yes, I have been thinking." He guided Marcus and Lincoln around the low spot in the road without breaking pace. "I know what the arrangement was when you came here. I know you came as a housekeeper. I know I told you I wasn't looking for a wife." He paused, gathering. "I want you to know that whatever you want, if you want to stay on as you are, if you want to go, if you want something else entirely, I will not make it difficult. But I want you to know what I want so you have the full picture." "What do you want?" she asked, even though she knew. He pulled the wagon to a stop just inside the ranch gate and turned to look at her in the early dark. "I want to marry you, Pearl. I want you to stay on this land because you choose to, because it's yours as much as mine, not because you need the wage or have nowhere else to be. I want to know what you think about things for the rest of my life. I want—" He stopped, and the word that came next surprised him, because he had not known it was the one he was going to say until it was already in the air. "I want to be the person you tell your troubles to at night, and I want you to be mine." The stars were coming out over the plains, faint and then brighter, in the way they always did in Wyoming, from uncertain to absolute. Pearl looked at him for a long moment, and in that moment she reviewed, briefly, everything: the narrow room in Kansas City, the advertisement, the long wagon ride, the evenings over lamplight, the bread board and the flowery hand and the morning kiss, and every conversation they had had in this wide-open country that had slowly, certainly, become the ground she stood on. "Yes," she said. "Benjamin. Yes." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat there for a moment in the cold October evening with the ranch lights ahead of them and the stars above, and the horses patient and warm. And Benjamin Wallace, who had not wanted a wife, who had only wanted someone to tell his troubles to at night, understood with sudden and absolute clarity that those two things had turned out to be the same. They were married in the first week of November, at the small church in Harrow Creek, by a preacher named Reverend Aldous, who was small and white-haired and solemn in the excellent way of men who have presided over both sorrows and joys, and understand both to be sacred. Hector stood beside Benjamin, which was right and fitting. Rosario Reyes came with their children, Alina and Miguel, and sat in the first pew with the kind of satisfied warmth of a woman whose husband had told her this day was coming and been entirely correct. Tom and Caleb Hatch sat together and cleaned up respectably. Agnes Prout was there, because of course she was, and she wept openly and without apology. Pearl had no family to bring. She had written to Clara Whitmore in Colorado, but Colorado was too far for a November journey. She walked down the aisle of the church alone, which she had thought might feel lonely, but did not. She was aware instead of the faces turned toward her, and the small community of people who had gathered to witness something they all considered, in their various ways, to be good news. And she was aware of Benjamin at the end of the aisle, watching her come toward him with an expression so plain and unguarded that it was more moving than any performance of emotion could have been. When Reverend Aldous asked the questions, they answered them clearly. When Benjamin took her hand, he held it as if he had been holding onto it in some form for months already, which in every way that mattered he had. They rode back to the Double W in the late afternoon light of a November sky that was doing its most dramatic work in gold and rose and deep blue at the edges, and Pearl Wallace. She had kept Pearl and added Wallace, because she liked the way the two sounded together, looked at the house as they came up the road, the same house she had looked at in July wondering what she had agreed to, and felt the particular rightness of belonging. That night, after the small celebration supper that Rosario had helped prepare and which filled the dining room with more warmth and noise than it had held in years, after Hector and Rosario and the children had gone back to town and the Hatch brothers had retreated to the bunkhouse, after the house had settled into the good quiet of a place well used, Benjamin came and found Pearl standing at the kitchen window looking out at the dark. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She turned. "My father," she said. "He would have liked you. He liked honest men." Benjamin came to stand beside her at the window. "I would have liked to know him," he said. They stood together in the kitchen, shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the Wyoming dark. "Tell me something," she said. "What?" "Something you haven't told me yet. There must be something left." He was quiet for a moment, considering. "The summer after Daniel died," he said slowly, "I planted a kitchen garden. I don't know why. I had never done it before. Daniel was the one who had been talking about planting one, and after he was gone I planted it anyway. It didn't do much that first year. Too dry. I planted it again the next summer and it did a little better. And this year it did well, and you've been using it all season." He paused. I think I was keeping it for someone. I didn't know who." "I know that sounds strange." Pearl took his hand. "It doesn't sound strange at all," she said. "It sounds exactly right." Outside, the November wind moved across the prairie, and inside the house that Benjamin and Daniel had built, in the kitchen with the garden beyond the window, Pearl and Benjamin Wallace stood together in the warm light, and the silence around them was not empty anymore. It was full of everything they had told each other, and everything still to be said, full of the particular sound of two lives that have found the frequency they were meant to occupy together. The first winter of their marriage was a hard one, as Wyoming winters tended to be, but it was the best winter Benjamin had spent on the Double W. He had not been aware, until now, of how much of the difficulty of a hard winter is the having of no one to face it with. Pearl was practical and unflappable about the cold in the way of someone who has managed worse with fewer resources, and she organized the winter stores with a thoroughness that surprised even Hector, who had been doing the winter preparation for years. She put up preserved vegetables and fruit in the cellar with a systematic efficiency. She made sure the firewood was stacked properly against the house. She identified a gap in the bunkhouse insulation that the Hatch brothers had been suffering through for 2 seasons and had never thought to mention, and had it fixed before the worst of the cold arrived. Benjamin watched her move through the ranch with the settled confidence of someone who has decided that a place is hers, and felt something warm and steady in his chest that he was beginning to identify as the particular satisfaction of a man who has, against his own predictions, gotten very lucky. They talked every night. It was the thing he had wanted most, the thing he had written into that strange, awkward advertisement without quite knowing how to say it, and it was the thing that turned out to be most real. They talked about the cattle and the land and the neighbors and the news that drifted up from Cheyenne and the wider territory. They talked about books, because Pearl had a traveling library's worth of reading in her trunk, and she had begun augmenting Benjamin's sparse shelf. And he read more in that winter than he had since his schoolboy years, and found he had opinions about what he read, and that Pearl engaged with those opinions with a vigor that sometimes turned dinner into a genuine debate, and was always more interesting than silence. They talked about harder things too, about what they each wanted the future to hold. About the ranch, and how Benjamin had always imagined expanding the herd but had not done it because the capital required felt risky for one man alone, and how it felt different now, not reckless but possible. About children, which they both approached with the honesty they brought to everything else, Pearl saying that she had always thought she would have children, but that she had also learned not to plan too firmly on things she could not control, and Benjamin saying that he would like that very much, a family in this house, children who would know the land the way he and Daniel had known it, and that he was aware it was not something to be decided unilaterally, and Pearl squeezing his hand and saying she knew, and yes, she would like that too. By February, Pearl knew she was expecting their first child. She told Benjamin on a Sunday morning before church, when they were both at the kitchen table with coffee, in the plain direct way she told him most things. His face went through several rapid expressions: surprise, and then a joy so genuine and undefended that it made her eyes sting, and then something that was very near to the expression she had seen the day he talked about Daniel's porch, that mixture of gladness and a recognition of all the years before the gladness. He came around the table and held her face in his hands and looked at her as if she had handed him something that he had not known was possible to receive. "Pearl," he said, and could not follow it with anything, and she put her hands over his and did not need him to. The spring of 1879 was exceptional on the double W. The rains came in measured, useful amounts rather than all at once, which was rare. The winter wheat that Pearl had suggested they try on the south section, something Benjamin had been skeptical about, came up strong and green. The cattle herd had wintered well. Hector's daughter Alina, who was 7 and extremely enterprising, had taken a particular interest in the garden and could be found there most Saturday afternoons, digging with the focused intensity of someone who has found her vocation, under Pearl's patient tutelage. Benjamin fixed the north fence line properly, with new posts and wire, and in the spring sweep of the North Range found no locoweed casualties among the cattle. He told Pearl, who said that she was glad, and that she thought the spring was a good one, and he agreed, leaning on the fence rail in the morning light, looking out at the range with the feeling of a man who is at peace with what he can see in front of him. James Reeves, the lawyer, had finally brought Carver's land agent schemes fully to the attention of the territorial authorities, in part because of the letter that Benjamin had sent, and several others like it that had accumulated from other ranchers and settlers. Carver was removed from his position in May of 1879, and while Pearl and Benjamin heard the news secondhand through Agnes Prout, who heard everything, they sat with the satisfaction of it quietly. Martha Fielding sent a letter in June, saying her homestead was doing well and her son had come from Illinois to help her, and she thanked Benjamin and Pearl again, and Pearl read the letter aloud to Benjamin at the supper table and then folded it carefully and kept it. Their son was born in October of 1879, a healthy boy who arrived on a cold and beautiful Wednesday with Harrow Creek's doctor, a steady woman named Dr. Harriet Coe, who had set up her practice the year prior, attending. Benjamin stayed as close as he was permitted and paced the corridor for 3 hours in a state of barely contained fear that Hector sat with him through, neither of them saying much, which was exactly right. When Dr. Coe came out and told him he had a son and that Pearl was well and resting, Benjamin went very still for a moment, in the way that a man goes still when he has been braced for something and finds instead that it is the good version, the version he had not let himself hope for too hard. He went in to Pearl, who was exhausted and pale, and had never looked so completely herself to him, so real and present and alive. She had the baby in the crook of her arm, a small, red-faced, extremely disgruntled-looking person who had clearly found the transition to the outside world thoroughly unreasonable. "He is not very happy about any of this," Pearl said, in the tired, amused voice of a woman who has just done something extraordinary. "He'll adjust," Benjamin said, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed, looking at his son with an expression that he was not able to control and did not try to. "What shall we call him?" Pearl asked. Benjamin had thought about this. "Daniel," he said, "if you agree." Pearl looked at him, understanding everything the name contained. "Daniel Wallace," she said. "Yes. I think that's right." Benjamin reached out and touched the baby's small fist with one finger, and Daniel Wallace opened his eyes and appeared to focus, briefly and with considerable suspicion, on his father. "Hello," Benjamin said, very quietly. The baby made a small sound and closed his eyes again, apparently satisfied or simply asleep. Pearl laughed, soft and tired, and Benjamin looked at her and then at their son, and then at the window where the October light was going gold. And he thought about the advertisement he had written in May of 1878 in the office of the Harrow Creek Gazette, stiff and strange and honest, saying he was not looking for a wife. He thought about how wrong he had been and how right it had turned out to be that he had been wrong. The years that followed were not without their difficulties, because that is the nature of years, and the nature of Wyoming territory in the late 19th century, which was a place of extraordinary beauty and ordinary hardship in roughly equal measure. There were bad winters and good ones. There were market prices that dropped and market prices that improved. There was a drought year, 1881, that hit the northern range hard, and Benjamin and Hector and the Hatch brothers worked through it with the grim, methodical endurance of people who understand that land asks for commitment, and not just affection. Pearl managed the household with the same quality of practical steadiness, cutting where cutting was needed, finding ways through that Benjamin sometimes did not see until she pointed them out. They were partners in the complete sense of the word, which was not always common in that time and place, and which they both understood to be something to protect. Benjamin consulted Pearl on decisions about the ranch with the genuine intention of being informed by her judgment, not as a courtesy, but because her judgment had repeatedly proven sharp, and because he had learned, in the first winter of their marriage, that thinking alongside her produced better outcomes than thinking alone. Pearl ran the household finances with a precision that Daniel would have needed a very different sort of person to manage, and the ranch's books were in better order in 1881 than they had ever been. Their daughter arrived in the spring of 1882 in the improved manner of a birth attended by the now well-established Dr. Coe, and in a household that had had 2 years to practice at this. She was small and dark-haired and had Pearl's gray-green eyes, and they named her Eliza, which had been Pearl's grandmother's name and which Pearl had carried as a middle name herself and had always liked the sound of. Daniel, who was 2.5 and had opinions about everything, inspected his sister with the gravity of someone assigned a critical responsibility and appeared to find her acceptable. Benjamin watched Pearl with their daughter in the lamplight and felt the particular joy of a man who understands, fully, that the life he is living is the one he was meant to live, even though it was not the life he had planned. He had planned for solitude. He had planned for the ranch and the cattle and the long nights talking to nobody. He had planned for the specific, familiar shape of a loneliness that at least had the virtue of being known. He had gotten, instead, Pearl at the kitchen table reading Tennyson in the lamplight. Pearl with flour on her hands telling him he needed a lawyer. Pearl saying yes in a cold October evening with the stars coming out. Pearl reading Martha Fielding's letter aloud at the supper table and folding it carefully. Pearl exhausted and pale with Daniel in her arms. Pearl in the garden with Alina Reyes, both of them completely absorbed in the business of growing things. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the house had gone quiet, they still talked. This was the thing that had not changed, had grown, if anything, into something so established and essential that Benjamin sometimes thought it was the central fact of the ranch, more than the land or the cattle or the buildings. Pearl would sit across from him with her mending or her accounts book, and he would sit with his coffee, and they would talk about everything and nothing, the way they had since that 9th evening when he had come in from the horses and stayed in the kitchen doorway and told her about the steers on the North Range. He told her his troubles. All of them, the small ones about fence lines and water and cattle prices, and the large ones about fear and loss, and the particular weight of being responsible for a piece of land and a group of people. She told him hers in return, her own fears, her own griefs that had not entirely healed, her own occasional loneliness for her father and the life in Missouri that had been hard but had been home, and her own joys, which were substantial and real. This was the thing the advertisement had almost said, and had not quite known how to say, that what he had wanted at the bottom of it was not a housekeeper or a ranch companion or even, as he thought he had decided, not a wife. What he had wanted was this: someone to sit across from in the lamplight, someone to whom the troubles of a Wyoming night could be said aloud and would not fall into empty air. The Double W continued to grow through the 1880s, slowly and with intention. Benjamin expanded the herd by 150 head in 1883, the year the cattle market improved and the drought was decisively behind them. Caleb Hatch married a woman from Harrow Creek and moved into the foreman's cabin that Benjamin had built on the east side of the property, and Tom Hatch eventually moved on to a ranch of his own in Montana, which everyone agreed was the right thing for him, and they parted on excellent terms. 2 new hands came to work the expanded herd, a young man named Virgil and his cousin, a Shoshone man named James Running Horse, who proved to be one of the best cattlemen Benjamin had ever worked with, and who stayed on at the Double W for many years. In the town of Harrow Creek itself, things had grown. A proper school had been built in 1881, and Pearl was on the school committee, a position she brought the same thoroughness to that she brought to everything. She pushed for the school to have adequate books and for the teacher's salary to be respectable, and won both points over the objections of 2 members of the town council who felt both were excessive, and was comprehensively right about both. Daniel Wallace attended the school starting in 1885 and was a capable and extremely argumentative student, which his teacher found exasperating, and which both his parents found privately and unsurprisingly amusing. Hector Reyes retired from full-time ranch work in 1886, at which point Caleb took over as foreman. Hector moved into Harrow Creek to be with Rosario and Alina and Miguel, but he came out to the Double W regularly, because he and Benjamin had been friends for too long to stop entirely, and because Pearl's kitchen continued to produce the kind of meals that merit a 12-mile ride. He sat at their kitchen table on Sunday afternoons with the ease of family, which was what he was. On a Sunday afternoon in the fall of 1887, with Daniel 8 years old and Eliza 5, and the afternoon light doing everything it could with the October colors of the plains, Benjamin and Pearl sat on the wide porch that Daniel, the first Daniel, the lost one, had built in 3 weeks for a visit from their mother. They had coffee. The children were somewhere in the yard, audible in the intermittent, reassuring way of children who are fully occupied with something that requires no adult intervention. Hector was inside, probably eating the last of the apple cake. Pearl had a letter in her lap. It was from Clara Whitmore in Colorado, saying that she and her husband would be coming through Wyoming in the spring and could they stop at the Double W. And Pearl had already written back to say yes, of course, how wonderful, you must stay at least a week. Benjamin was watching the light on the grass. "Do you remember," he said, "that advertisement I wrote?" Pearl smiled. "I remember. I read it back and thought it sounded stiff and strange. I left it anyway because I didn't know how to make it say the right thing." "What was the right thing?" He turned to look at her. His face had the lines that 9 more years of Wyoming sun and wind had put there, and the eyes that his mother had called the color of good earth were warm and certain. "That I was terrified," he said, "and that I needed someone who would not make me feel stupid for it." Pearl reached over and put her hand on his. "You never seemed stupid," she said. "You seemed honest." He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat there on the porch in the October light, in the home they had made from a ranch and a newspaper advertisement, and a willingness to be honest with each other in the dark. The children's voices rose and fell in the yard. Inside, Hector laughed at something. The grass bent and straightened in the wind. There were things they still had to face: the territory's ongoing difficulties, the changes that were coming to the West as the 1880s moved toward the 1890s, the ordinary hard work of a ranch and a family and a life lived with intention. But those things would be faced the same way all the hard things had been faced, which was together, with honesty, in the lamplight of the kitchen at the end of the day. Benjamin Wallace, who had not wanted a wife, who had wanted only someone to tell his troubles to at night, had found out that those two things were not different things after all. They were the same thing, expressed in the full language of a life shared. Pearl Wallace, who had come west with a trunk and a carpet bag and a fierce, quiet determination and a capacity for listening that was one of the great gifts of her life, had found in that wide-open country exactly what she had not known she was looking for. Not safety exactly, not ease, but solidity, ground that held. The light moved across the plains. The wind said its endless, indifferent peace. On the porch of the Double W, Benjamin held Pearl's hand, and the silence around them was so full it left room for nothing to be missing. 2 years later, in the spring of 1889, Wyoming was on the verge of becoming a state, a fact which generated considerable talk in Harrow Creek and on the ranch alike. Wyoming territory had been unusual in the West for having granted women the right to vote in 1869, a fact that Pearl had known before she had ever come to the territory, and which had been, in the back of her mind, one of the small reasons the advertisement had not seemed entirely impractical. She had voted in every election since her arrival, which she did with the same practical conviction she brought to everything else, and which Benjamin supported without reservation, because he had listened to her think about things for long enough to understand that a polity that excluded her judgment was a polity operating at a significant disadvantage. Daniel, who was 10, had strong opinions about Wyoming statehood, most of them derivative of opinions he had heard at the kitchen table over the years. Eliza, who was 7, had decided she wanted to be a doctor when she grew up, an ambition that had apparently been fixed by 2 visits to Dr. Harriet Coe's office, the second of which had included watching Dr. Coe set a broken finger with an efficiency that Eliza had found deeply impressive. Benjamin and Pearl both said that was a fine ambition and she should pursue it, which was the only possible correct response. James' running horse had by 1889 become not just the Double W's most capable hand, but something of a friend to both Benjamin and Pearl, who had gradually, over years, learned enough about each other that the relationship had moved from professional respect into genuine regard. James was quiet in the way that certain very competent people are quiet, and he had a dry humor that emerged in unexpected moments and had made Pearl laugh harder than she had expected on more than one occasion. He had a son, Thomas, who was 3 years younger than Daniel, and who would, in a few years, become Daniel's closest companion and general partner in the particular kinds of trouble that capable, curious boys on Wyoming ranches tend to generate. The Double W in 1889 was a working, living place, full of the accumulated layers of years. The garden that Pearl had tended from the struggling remnants Benjamin had planted in grief, now producing more than the house could use and supplying Hector's household in town regularly. The porch Daniel had built, where the family sat in the evenings when the weather allowed. The expanded herd, the new calves of every spring, the rhythms of the land that Benjamin had learned as a young man, and that he and Pearl had learned together in a different way. The way you learn something when you are committed to it not just from duty but from choice. On the evening of Wyoming statehood, July 10, 1890, there was a celebration in Harrow Creek that drew the whole surrounding area. The Wallaces went in the wagon, all four of them, with Hector and Rosario meeting them in town, and the Ray's children, who were now young adults and thoroughly themselves, joining the general celebration. There was music from a fiddle and a very enthusiastic harmonica player, and lanterns strung along the main street, and a general atmosphere of an occasion that everyone understood to be real. Daniel danced with Alina Reyes, who was now 19 and had inherited her father's capacity for decisive action, and was thoroughly flustered by the experience in the way of 10-year-old boys confronted with the social expectations of dancing. Eliza ate 3 pieces of cake without apparent difficulty, and observed the general proceedings with the composed scientific interest that was becoming her particular characteristic. Benjamin and Pearl danced because Pearl said they should, and because on this point, as on most points, Benjamin had no inclination to disagree. He had learned to dance adequately but not well in the years of their marriage, in the way a man learns things that his wife makes seem worth learning, and Pearl was a genuinely good dancer, which meant that dancing with her was pleasant even for someone who was not skilled at it, because her sense of rhythm was reliable enough to compensate for his. They danced in the lantern light on the main street of Harrow Creek, while the fiddle played something fast and the harmonica player kept up. And around them, the town they had been part of for more than a decade celebrated the fact of its new identity. And Pearl laughed when Benjamin almost stepped on her foot and didn't. And he smiled the smile that had taken so long to come back to his face, and had now, after years of practice, appeared as reliably as the morning. He danced with his wife in the light of their town on the night their territory became a state, and he thought about none of the things he had expected to be thinking about at 34. He thought instead about the kitchen table and the lamplight and 12 years of evenings, and a boy named Daniel who was trying to dance with Alina Reyes and not quite managing, and a girl named Eliza who was going to be a doctor in a state that had been the first in the country to say she had the right to decide things for herself. He thought about Pearl in the morning kitchen with flour on her hands and a Tennyson poem and a gray-green gaze that saw clearly. He had not wanted a wife. He had wanted someone to tell his troubles to at night. He had gotten both, which was either the same thing or the best surprise, and on reflection he thought it was the same thing and the best surprise, in exactly equal measure. They drove home later that night under a sky so full of stars that it seemed excessive, even for Wyoming. The children were asleep in the back of the wagon, leaned together, Daniel's head tilted to one side and Eliza perfectly upright even in sleep, which was exactly characteristic of both of them. The bays Marcus and Lincoln had long since been replaced by a new pair, but Benjamin still named his horses carefully, as he always had. Pearl leaned against his shoulder on the wagon seat, the way she had learned to over the years, and he adjusted the reins to his other hand to put his arm around her, the way he had learned to do in return. The ranch came into view on the rise, the windows dark, the buildings solid and familiar against the star-bright sky. "Good night tonight," she said. "Yes," he said. "Are you happy, Benjamin?" He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was thinking about something honestly rather than reaching for the easy answer. "I am," he said, "more than I knew to want." She turned her face up and kissed him once, warm and certain, and then leaned back against his shoulder. He drove the rest of the way home through the Wyoming dark, with his wife beside him and his children asleep behind him and the stars overhead doing their ancient, indifferent, magnificent work. The double W was lit in the first light of Tuesday morning when Pearl came downstairs and started the kitchen fire, and the smell of wood smoke and coffee filled the house the way it had for 12 years. And when Benjamin came down, he found her at the kitchen window with her coffee looking out at the garden in the early light, the same posture he had found her in on the night of their wedding, and he came to stand beside her the same way, shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the life they had built. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, the same question he had asked 12 years ago. She turned and looked at him, and her smile was the smile of a woman who has received every answer and is still glad to be asked. "This," she said simply, "all of this." He put his arm around her. Outside, the garden was coming into its spring color, the first green things pushing up through the turned earth. In the yard beyond, in a little while, there would be the sound of children and horses and the day's work beginning. In the house, the warmth of the kitchen fire was spreading room by room. The wind moved across the plains in its eternal, unhurried way. Benjamin Wallace, who had written an awkward advertisement in a newspaper and had been answered by a woman with gray-green eyes and flour on her hands and a Tennyson poem and a willingness to listen, held his wife in the kitchen of the house they had made together, and the silence around them was the fullest silence in Wyoming, full of everything they had ever told each other in the dark, every trouble laid down between them and carried between them, and transformed by the simple, extraordinary act of being known. The kitchen garden grew. The cattle grazed the good grass of the double W. The children grew toward who they were going to be. The seasons turned on the high plains the way they always had and always would, indifferent to individual human stories but providing, in their turning, exactly the ground on which those stories could be lived. And in the evenings, as they always had and would continue to do, Pearl and Benjamin Wallace sat across the kitchen table from each other in the lamplight and talked about the ranch and the land and the children and the town and the wide world beyond the plains, about trouble and hope and memory and the future, about everything that needed saying and some things that did not need saying at all but were said anyway, because they were for each other, and because that was what the evenings were for. He had not wanted a wife. He had wanted someone to tell his troubles to at night. He had been, in the most complete and fortunate way, entirely wrong about the difference.